Enough electoral votes, more than 270, more than enough to become the 44th president of the United States. He will be the first African-American president of the United States.
I've been broke all my life, but I kept hope all them nights. You see business in my city? Yeah, they closed all them twice. I was just riding down Salem, all them damn potholes I can't drive. I know y'all can fix it faster, but I know y'all won't try. Don't nobody care about us, and that's why I don't vote. Voted for Obama back in 2012, I remember that's when I had hope. He was saying, yes, we can. And everybody got less food stamps. And when I turned 21, I was still broke. I'd never vote again. I don't think I ever had a president make my life better. Did it all on my own. Ain't no politician ever do a nice gesture. I don't even know the mayor's name. I ain't never seen her one time ever. Tell me how she gonna help the city. What I'm supposed to do, write letters? What I'm supposed to do, blame Trump? He ain't never really gave a Ain't nobody raised minimum wage. None of these jobs pay enough. I think they just wanna keep us broke, cause they ain't putting nothing in place for us. This how all my people feel, but we gotta learn. We complained enough, let me change it up. Everything I just said, everybody I know think the same way. See, they don't wanna see us vote, and we never do, so we see the same thing. But all our votes really do count, and they'll never really let it show. So now I'm finna break it down, cause if I don't, you would probably never know. First thing first, you know back in middle school when they taught us, it was 3 branches of the government. We forgot it when we got older. It's the judicial, the legislative, and executive. But all we know is the executive. That's the mayor or the governor and the president. Now none of them 3 people make no laws, they just be checking them. The laws come to their desk and all they do is say no or yes to it. So when the news station tried to tell us that Barack Obama couldn't put us on, we was all salty at Obama when it was the Congress members all along. We gotta focus on the legislative branch, yeah, they the ones that make the laws. Yeah, they the ones write how much food stamp money you get on the card. But when people that wanted to help us wanted the job, I know they probably lost. Cause we ain't even know their name, we ain't know their face, we ain't know at all. So the Congress or the State House, that's legislative, they make laws. So what we want from the president is what they do, okay y'all? See, they election every 2 years, but we don't ever even go to those. The Congress, they can raise minimum wage, but we ain't even really know it though. So you know how back in 08, when we all voted for Obama, we was all supposed to go back in 2010 and vote for the Congress. Cause they the ones make child support laws, they the ones choose if your kids at school get to eat steak or corn dogs. The State House make the court costs. So if the country failed, then you can't say it's them, it's your fault. Cause y'all ain't know to vote for Congress members that was for y'all. And they don't gotta leave after 4 years, and we just let them sit. See, they don't wanna tell you this, they want you to focus on the president. Now the 3rd branch is the judicial, that's judges. They the reason why John Crawford and Trayvon ain't had justice. So when Meek Mill got locked up just for popping willies, we blame the judge and not the city when they let her get voted in, cause they ain't know who to vote against. Imagine life on the other side. Roads better, schools better, everybody get their license back, grocery store food better, custody of your kids back, homeless people get new shelters. If we gon' fix the U.S., we gotta start with them 2 letters, me and you. Somebody told us that the government wanna keep us broke, but the only reason why those people in the government is cause we ain't vote. And I ain't talking about the president, I'm talking about the ones we ain't know. See, they was gonna try to keep it low, but it's gonna hurt them when they see the pros.
Every time you stay home, someone is making a decision about you, making decisions about the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food your kids eat, and how much money you bring home every 2 weeks. So every time you sit out an election, every time you don't show up because you think it doesn't matter, someone else is happy that you didn't show up, so they can make that decision for you. Vote.
Well, hello, everyone. We are so excited to be on our new platform, StreamYard. We've evolved. As of right now, you can see us live on IG, Facebook, YouTube, and on our website, BTheNow.org. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Cheryl O'Neill, and I am the founder and CEO of BTheNow. The purpose of BTheNow our mission is to motivate and educate the community to use the power of their voice and their vote to make a difference. And if we needed that at any time, now is the time that we need it, because this election year is the most important election of our lifetime. It is the difference between us continuing our democracy or possibly being in a dictatorship. Take it however you want. But it's time for us to really focus on what we need to do this year in order to get the right people in office that have our best interest at heart. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about BTheNow before we get started with our guest speaker, because this forum is all about it's a continuation of the Voting Rights Act. What we did about a month ago, we went into the history of the Voting Rights Act, why we needed it, and so on and so forth, and what that means for us today. So before I go into that and introduce our speaker, I do, again, want to talk more about BTheNow. BTheNow was birthed in 2020. It was actually birthed during a very difficult time. We had COVID. We were in the middle of a pandemic. We had a lot of senseless killings. We had riots. We had so much going on, marching, and people were upset. People didn't know what to do. And I had a conversation with a few individuals, and while they were complaining, and I'll start talking to them about, we got to get out and vote. And some of these people were saying they didn't know if they wanted to vote. And I couldn't believe it. So you were complaining on one end, but then you didn't want to take action and use the one power that you have to make a difference. So, I knew at that point in time I needed to do something. I didn't know what, but BTheNow was birthed out of that. And if you guys, if you haven't already, go to our website, BTheNow.org. Check out what we're doing. Check out what we're doing with our forums. Check out what we're doing with the youth, because it is extremely important that we get educated on what's happening today. So I'm gonna move on and introduce our guest speaker for tonight. It is State Representative Derrick Jackson out of District 68 down in Fayette County. He'll explain exactly where he's located, where his district is located. Derrick has won countless awards. I'm gonna let him explain that to you as well, because we don't have time. I don't have time to name all of them. But what he's doing in the community locally, what he's doing on the state level, and what he's doing nationally is impeccable. And we need more people like him to share what is needed for this country, to use his voice to rally everyone to get out and do what they need to do this election cycle. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Derrick. And so Derrick, how are you?
Cheryl, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I see you have that Alpha Phi Alpha up there.
Yeah, well, you always got to represent your colors. You know that.
Okay, ski-wee. But Derrick, tell the people a little bit about yourself before, I start asking you certain questions, but definitely tell people about yourself, what you've done in the past, what you're currently doing. And, I don't know if you want to share some things that could possibly happen in the future, but I'll turn it over to you.
Well, first off, it's always great to be with BTheNow, Cheryl. Appreciate the work that you're doing, not just here locally in Georgia, but nationally. BTheNow, for those who don't know, goes across these United States. And so I appreciate the work that you've been doing since 2020, basically sounding off the alarm, right? And I have been sounding off the alarm myself. I'm a retired naval officer. Did 22 years in the Navy. And 20 years ago when I retired, I always tell folks I don't look like I retired 20 years ago, but I did. I discovered this thing about service. Service became part of my DNA. And so I realized when I went to corporate America in 2005, still was not, intrinsically satisfied, if you will. And so I still did work in the community, did work not just in my community, but also in the state. Then I ran for office in 2016. And then that's when I got elected. I represent District 68, as you already mentioned. Started off covering 7 cities, but after some gerrymandering 2 years ago, I now only cover 6 cities, which is part of Fulton and Fayette counties. But the most important thing to me, Cheryl, other than being a husband, a father, my wife and I, we have 7 amazing children and 1 grandson. I really like just being in the community, rolling up my sleeve, just doing the work, because I realize that the gifts that God has provided me are just that. They're gifts, and that those gifts can't not just be withheld to serve me, myself, and I. And so it's always about we for me. It's about us. And when you realize, when you think about coming from a mentality of we and us, you'll see why tonight I really appreciate BTheNow selecting me to be the speaker, because when you're thinking about voting, voting is, although it's an individual effort, but it's a collective effort. And so I look forward to this evening conversation around voting rights and continue on the conversation that we started about 4 weeks ago.
Thank you, Derek. So again, we are going to focus on the Voting Rights Act and lead into what's currently going on with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But let's start off here. How did we get here? How do we get to this point where we need to continuously talk about the Voting Rights Act? We're worried about getting people excited or getting them riled up about voting in these coming elections. And I guess I would say, some people are disenchanted. If that's the word, disenchanted, frustrated. There's so many other words that I can use that I've been hearing. How do we get to this point where people are still hesitant on what they need to do to to make a change in this country?
That's an excellent question, Cheryl, because when you think about how did we get here, in order to understand the present, the history provides us the information, right? And so just to do a quick recap, certainly not a history lesson to our audience this evening, but in order to really understand the present, you got to talk about the past. You got to talk about the history, because the history will inform us in the present. So I really like to think that it really started in the Reconstruction era. That 14-year period when our ancestors were set free from 1863 to 1877. That 14-year period really define on where we are today. Now, a lot of folks may say, well, how are you drawing that connection between Reconstruction era and today? Well, when Abraham Lincoln set us free, the Emancipation Proclamation, there was a backlash immediately about 2 years later. And that backlash was the KKK in 1865 when they were founded. That 2-year period, during that 2-year period, Blacks were getting elected to office. Blacks were becoming part of the American dream. They were starting businesses. They were in public office. They were exercising their right to vote. But there was a backlash, right? And that same backlash that took place right after Reconstruction, I'm going to draw another parallel, the backlash of the Barack Obama era. But in order to really talk about voting rights, it didn't start in 1965. It started in 1866. The very first Voting Rights Act was in concert with the Civil Rights Act. Both of those started in 1866. And if I may read specifically, it said the Voting Rights Act is the historical Civil Rights Act law that is meant to ensure the right to vote that was denied to people of color based on their race. And so in 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 grants citizenship, but not the right to vote to all Native born Americans, because they were saying slaves were not native to this land. And so then, in their infinite wisdom, while blacks were being elected in 1863, 64, and 65, and 1869, blacks started saying, well, we're going to correct that error with the 15th Amendment. And so in 1869, the 15th Amendment was passed. But they did not, they cut us short, Cheryl. How did they cut us short? The 15th Amendment only allowed black men to vote. So think about that. And the reason why I want to pause there, because we tend to think of this patriarchal, misogynistic system. That was done by design, because then even black men did not afford black women an opportunity to vote. So white men were already doing that, right? White men did not allow for white women to vote. So here you have black men and white men now not allowing the voice of women to be heard. Let me fast forward. In 1896 is when blacks were getting too much of themselves, right? We started filling in the offices across the southern states. This is the very first time we witnessed the second level of the backlash, right? And I'm going to pinpoint the KKK to a degree to 1896, because there was a rash of lynching going on, killings going on, murder and rapes of black men and black women, right? And children. And so you figure for that 36-year period, blacks were starting to feel like citizens from 1863 to 1896. But then Louisiana started this thing called the lit test. Y'all know what the lit test is, right? You're not, are you really black, dark enough, right? That's the very first time we start seeing this, can you read? Can you write? What's your name? That kind of stuff. It was in 1896. Let me fast forward. In 1940, we went from 45% black men registered to vote during that 36 period. But then in 1940, the birth of Jim Crow came. The third backlash of the Reconstruction, right? We are now free. And one of the interesting things here, Cheryl, in 1940, only 3% of African Americans in the United States were eligible to vote. We went from 45% down to 3%.
Wow.
Okay. Wow. Now, why is that significant? Because if you transport us to 2024, where you think about a lot of blacks do not vote, they don't trust the system. They think the government is doing something. And so that wasn't, something that was just birthed this year. There is a long lineage of the government doing things to the black and brown community. And so you go from 1940, Cheryl, to 1964. And I'm just trying to speed this along here. 1964 is when we had the Civil Rights Act, because the first Civil Rights Act was not enough. And so we had to fine tune it to make sure we capture the things that the first one didn't take care of 100 years ago. We took care of it on the back end. So that's when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed into law by then LBJ. But that still was not enough. Civil rights was like a foundation for citizenship. But then we came back to clean things up in 1965 with the Voter Rights Act. But there's one clause in the Voter Rights Act that always pained me. Every 25 years, Congress will have the opportunity to reauthorize if black people in this country can vote or not. No one else. But they did. Every 25 years, they will, reauthorize for blacks in this country to vote. So think about that. Then there was this fourth wave, the fourth backlash. And that happened right after 1972. 1972, why is that important? Because in 1972, we started to witness it right here in Georgia, for example. We witnessed our very first Black from the South to go up to Congress. And that is our friend Cheryl, the Ambassador Andrew Young.
Right.
He was the first. But there was also a woman I would like to highlight, or two, that took place that made history as well. Because Andy Young certainly made history in 1972. But there are two women I would like to highlight this evening. One is Barbara Jordan out of Houston, Texas. She too was elected in 1972 and went up and represented Texas in Washington, D.C. The other woman that made history during that same year was Shirley Chisholm.
That's right.
She not only went to Congress, but she ran for president in 1972. So that's when the fourth backlash started, where the Jim Crow, they were like, wait a minute. Every time we position and allow for Blacks in this country to progress, we ended up getting some heat, right? Because all we wanted to do was to make sure we kept a roof over our head and food on the table for our family. But we also wanted this thing called equality and equity. And voting allowed for us to do that, to see representation in our city and in our state. And so these kind of things became very, very important to us when you start talking about why the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was so important. In 1982, Ronald Reagan signed a 25-year extension for the very first time. Everyone in Congress said yes. They reauthorized the Voting Rights Act for the very first time. Unanimous. They were like, yes, Blacks should vote. Why is that important? Because if they had to reauthorize for Blacks to vote today, I don't think we're going to get the same response, which is the reason why before the late, great icon, Honorable John Lewis died, they were already in the mix of making sure that whatever we did not clean up with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was going to take care of it. I'll get to that in a second. The last point, and I open up for your questions, but the last point, the fifth backlash was Barack Obama in 2008. Blacks, men and women, had record number of votes that went and he elected the first Black president in the history of this country. And they immediately went to work to say this would never happen again. And that fifth backlash was experienced in 2010 when the Tea Party came in. The Tea Party, when they came in, they already had an agenda to make sure that they will be in position one day to chip away the Voting Rights Act. And so 3 years after Tea Party came in 2013, that's when they convinced the Supreme Court to gut Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Why is that important? Because it removed the pre-clearance requirement. So before any of the states, of the 50 states, made changes to their voting rights, they had to submit what those changes would be and the implication of those changes to the Department of Justice. But once that happened in July of 2013, Shelby versus Holder, and Attorney General Eric Holder was the AG at the time, and they lost that case immediately after 2013. 48 states went to work. They started chipping away the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because that pre-clearance requirement was removed. The Chief Justice Roberts said, if you want this codified into law, send it back to the legislature, which is that's what prompted the folks up in Congress to start developing the today John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which they still have not passed, by the way. And so when you have these 48 states chipping away every year since 2013, that explains how we got here today in 2024. 11 years later, you have the most egregious anti-voting laws to try to take us back to Reconstruction era, when Blacks could be elected, but they had no voting power. Black men and Black women had no voice in our society. And so if you don't think they would take us back that far, Cheryl, think again. Ask all the women in the United States where we all thought, men included, that Roe v. Wade, something that was the precedent for 50 years, they overturned Roe v. Wade. If you don't think that was far enough, Cheryl, just recently, Arizona just tripped a law that is 1864, 160 years ago, around abortion rights. 160 years ago. So if you don't think that they would take a sledgehammer at all of these laws that are in place, from the 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, right? All the laws over the last 160 plus years, 160 years. Open your eyes.
I agree with you totally, Derek. And, you know, I tell people this all the time. You have to know your past in order for you to know what's happening currently in the present, and then you can predict your future. Because no one ever thought that we would be back in the situation that we were like over 50 years ago. So, and there are a lot of people out there a lot of adults who did not know in the 1800s that we had Black men in Congress and the Senate. And so to hear that, they're like, well, what happened between then and the civil rights movement? And I'm so glad that you gave a timeline, explained exactly what happened, because in addition to that, the laws were changed, and people today are so, I don't know if they're just arrogant or they just don't want to know the facts, but they have to realize that the same thing, we are in the same situation now that we were then. And so with the exclusion of the affirmative action, Roe versus Wade, the Voting Rights Act not being not going up and being approved or voted on, we are setting ourselves up where we could literally be at a point where we don't have any rights. And
No, I'm about to say, so I just want to address the 3 points that you're making, right? I think the first point, over the last 161 years, that's what we're talking about, 161 years. Today, we're more comfortable. See, because the sense of urgency 161 years ago, our ancestors were just freed, right? So they were trying to figure it out. They ran for office and got elected, right? There were, when you think about Reconstruction era, all the black men that were elected for office, and those who can read and write. I mean, think about Frederick Douglass, for example. Frederick Douglass was basically negotiating 14 times with Abraham Lincoln. And so this wasn't about did we have the intellectual or the curiosity or the capacity to govern. Obviously, we did, right? The challenge was having access and options. And so these laws stripped away our access and options that others enjoyed. And so that's where the friction really is. But now that friction, Cheryl, doesn't really exist today. We can live where other people live. We can drive where other people may drive. So we're comfortable, right? We don't hear lynchings, dozens of lynching happening every day, right? You just don't hear those sort of things. And so we're comfortable. But
you may not hear lynchings, but you hear people being gunned down. I mean, you can equate. It may not be the same. It may not be the same, but it's similar. You can use that as an analogy or an example. So a lot of the same things that were happening then are definitely happening now.
You're exactly right. But I think the answer to your second question, we did not realize that these laws can be overturned, right? No one in their infinite wisdom would have thought Roe v. Wade, affirmative action, right? Abortion rights will be overturned, right? We didn't anticipate that we would ever have a president with 91 felonies, right? Because you see where I'm going here? I mean, because even those who constructed the Constitution, they had a particular individual in mind to be the president of these United States. Now, they certainly did not envision someone like Barack Obama, right? Or you or I becoming the president of the United States, right? There's clear evidence of that. We just look at the history book and we can clearly see the profile of the presidents of the past, right? And so every time, and that brings me to my third response to your third point. Every time African Americans progress in the United States, there was a backlash, right? There was a very harsh response, right? And I gave you 5 particular responses that took place over 160 years. But it was always experienced when Blacks took 2 or 3 steps ahead, only to be dealt with this very harsh reality that we were never considered equal or citizens or humans. Every time we were had to deal with a harsh reality of, I call them domestic terroristic threats. I mean, take Black Wall Street, for example, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? It wasn't about can we become entrepreneurs or self-reliant or not only create bootstraps, but we manufactured our own boots and put them on, right? Black Wall Street, Rosewood, or even right here in Atlanta. Every time we sort of made this progress, we encounter mass killings, we encounter change of the law. We've always had to deal with the harsh reality that we were not good enough. We were not good enough to be citizens in these United States. And so that's the reason why when you think about those 3 points I just made, BTheNow, organizations such as yours, sounding the alarm, saying, wake up, wake up. I know the young people love to say, stay woke, but it seemed like the sleeping giant since 2008 went back to sleep. And when we go to sleep, those who have ill intent and malicious intent tend to do a lot of harm to those who simply just want equal access and the same options as everyone else.
Right. I appreciate those comments, Derek. You're spot on. But you know what I want to do? I want to make this more interactive. So for those of you who are out there on IG, on Facebook, YouTube, on our site, start typing in some questions to ask Derek. And then also I want to bring in Erica, and I also want to bring in Kay because I know they had some questions that they definitely wanted to ask you as well. But, this is a time for us to learn, because even though I started this organization in 2020, I still don't know everything. I'm still learning every single day, and I'm always asking questions. So, I always think about the people that are voting for the first time. I'm thinking about those 17 and a half year olds who don't know what to do. I'm thinking about, even these grownups who are trying to figure it out, who may not vote on a regular basis. But now they're like, I got to do something. Or I'm thinking about those individuals who don't speak English that were new to this country, that are trying to figure out, who do I vote for? What do I do? Why are so many people upset? They don't understand the history of this country when it comes to voting and our rights. So, Erica, I'm bringing in Erica. What questions do you have for Derek?
Actually, I posted my questions in one of the chats, but the big question I had was going back to something that Derek had stated about the fact that nobody ever fathomed that these laws that have stood in place for so long could possibly be overturned. Because nobody thought about it, I tend to believe there was no mitigation strategy put in place. So that being said, what are our next steps? What do we do now to right these wrongs? How do we start to put together a strategy to get these laws reenacted, or more modern laws, more applicable to the times, come in to take their place?
That's an excellent question, Erica. And I'll say, first thing first, we got to get out and vote. The very thing that they're trying to take away, we got to protect and preserve, right? Because voting allows for us to do everything else. You can't talk about Medicaid expansion if you can't vote. You can't talk about public education if you cannot vote. You cannot talk about making sure Medicaid and Medicare stays around if you cannot vote. You can't talk about Social Security if you cannot vote. So everything hinges upon the ability to vote and having that right to vote. That's number one. Number two, Erica, I think we gotta, despite the past, right, that 160 years that I just shared, we got to tell folks to trust the process, trust the government. If you can't trust the government, and I know people are going to say all these conspiracy theorists and the media, listen, we just went through COVID. That COVID was not 100 years ago. COVID was not 20 years ago. And a lot of good people died because they listened to the wrong individuals. They did not trust government. They died. And so trust hinges upon everything that we do. Trust hinges upon the relationships that we build in our homes, in our communities, in our cities, in our state, in our nation. Trust carries a lot of weight. Then there's this thing called love. The love for all mankind. Because in the end, when you strip away race, color, pigmentation, we're always going to be someone's father, husband, mother, wife, daughter, sister, brother, uncle, aunt. So we got to think about the human race. What is it that we need to do to preserve the human race? When you talk about clean energy, right? There's no, conspiracy around clean energy. I was reading something the other day, and somebody think that, oh, the world's going to be around. It's been around for millions and millions of years. It's going to be around for millions and millions of years in the future. But what about just simply being good stewards? For those of us in the present to be good stewards and take care of the earth for those who yet to come in the future, right? There's no conspiracy around that, right? Making sure that our most vulnerable in our society, our senior citizens and our children are taken care of when it comes down to medicine. Making sure our leaders of tomorrow get a proper education. Why are we talking about banning books, right? And so when you think about our society that God blessed us with, we all should be held accountable and responsible for taking care of the world in which we were given. You can only do that if you do it through love and trust. The third thing I would suggest in terms of next steps, Erica, I said voting is one, trust and love is the second, but then there's the third. We got to change these laws. These laws that are being placed on the books today can hurt us for hundreds of years. When they remove Roe, overturn Roe, who would have imagined when they overturned Roe that it would trip a law that was still on the books 160 years ago? And so we got to make sure that the laws not only govern us in the present, but we'll be able to still govern us in the future. I couldn't help but to think when Cheryl was doing her opening monologue, we have a democracy, but you have a presumptive nominee talking about dictatorship. We don't have kings and queens in the United States. We don't have dictators in the United States. I've been to countries, communist countries, where there's a dictator, a communist. Very different way of living. And so if we don't wake up, Erica, our next steps can very well find ourselves, if we don't do these other three things that I just mentioned, because the very thing that we think, that won't happen, my vote doesn't count, don't believe the hype.
I agree. I'm glad you said that, dear. But let's, you had three good points. But let's talk about the solution here. So those were some solutions, but let's talk about what people can actually do. Besides that, what people can do right now to get themselves positioned, to get themselves ready to be able to actually go to the polls, but also have a conversation with their family members, their friends, their colleagues, just to understand like who's doing what. Okay, you're voting. All right. Well, it's not enough for you to just get to the polls. You got to tell several other people. You got to bring 10 people with you. Those who are hesitant on voting, you got to have a longer conversation and find out where their hesitation is, but then also have the conversation on this is why we need to do this, and then those who are like, I'm not going to do anything. I'm not happy with either party. Get them to understand by you doing nothing, you really are doing something. You're voting for someone that you may not want in office. So it's extremely important that you use that power in some way, some form or fashion. If, even these younger people, there are a lot of younger people that are currently involved in the civics in this current election. I was talking to a young guy in California who was 16. I thought I was talking to a 30-year-old. He broke things down on what's going on in our current climate, from local government in California to on a national level. So these young kids, some of these young kids, even though they can't vote, they can use their voice and they can push those adults or those individuals who can vote to do so. So I guess, let's tell us, some steps on what we need to do. Like maybe one, getting registered. That's the first thing, and then move into that.
Well, that's a great question, Cheryl. And if I may plug BTheNow website, the very first step everyone, your audience should do is check your own voting status, right? If we were all flying on an airplane and there's some turbulence and the mask fell out of the ceiling of the airplane, they said before you render assistance to your neighbor, don your mask first. And so this is what you should do. Don your mask first by going to the BTheNow website. I'm sure you will give the web address, but go to the BTheNow website so folks can check their voting status and do it now. Don't procrastinate. Do it now so that way you can mitigate any potential issues that you may discover. Good people, citizens who've been voting all their lives have found themselves purged off the voting rolls. And especially if you are in one of the 11 southern states, you got to check your voting status first. Number two, check the voting status of everyone in your household. My wife and I, we got 7 young adults. 4 of them are away in college. We make sure that they too vote by way of absentee ballot, because we all know just because you are away, you should not forget your civic duty responsibility. And so that's number 2. Everyone in your household, make sure they're eligible to vote, because it makes no sense for us to go out and register strangers that we don't know, but you got folks in your own home who are not registered and not voting. So I always want to start off making sure your home is taken care of. Make sure your everybody in your household voting status is ready, legit, and ready to go. Number 3, I do appreciate voting registration, Cheryl. I know there's a lot of fraternities like your sorority, AKAs, my fraternity, Alphas, and all the Divine Nine. We do, and the churches, and the ACLU, and NAACP. A lot of non-government agencies do a phenomenal job registering folks. But the sad part of voter registration, Cheryl, is knowing after election day the number of folks who are registered that did not vote.
Right.
That is so egregious to me. That is so sad to me.
Right.
And I'm just going to use Georgia as an example. 2 years ago, over 700,000 registered, eligible, living, breathing voters did not vote. 700,000 registered voters. 700,000. 700,000. 700,000. Stacey lost, who was running for governor, lost by 300,000 votes. Okay? You do the math. I always tell folks, I know voting suppression is bad. It's horrible. It is. Voting suppression is bad. But what's worse than voter suppression? Low voter turnout. It's
Absolutely
worse than voter suppression. That means eligible registered voters who did not think it was worthy enough to simply take a few minutes and go cast their ballot.
And I want to chime in as we start to kind of circle around and bring it back to how we started, not just with Cheryl speaking to how the organization was birthed, from hearing, so many disheartening accounts of people just saying that they were just not interested, but also the video that we started tonight's forum with. And I think that brings it back full circle, not so much as a question for you, Mr. Jackson, but also just a point to ponder for everyone to kind of lead with some introspection and to ask themselves, but also to ask their neighbor, ask their friend, their children, their children's children, all of the things. What is it that makes you so disenchanted about it, right? You spoke mountains today of some historical moments, particularly for women and for people of color, of why this should not just feel like a civic duty. But that would be great, even if we had enough people who thought that that was what it was. But to really look at voting as the fundamental birthright, right, that we actually have, and when you add to that all of the lives lost and the bloodshed and all of the things to make sure that we had that birthright, to let it squander like that. And so I think that brings us back to what can we do? And this is not us as an organization, but to really pose the question and cause people to reflect and say, am I mature enough? This is what I have to say to my children. I have a 5-year-old who has a hard time when he does not win the game. And I look at people who take their ball and go home when their candidate does not win, or when they say, it's the least of two evils, or whatever have you, all as rationale to not vote, to withhold their right. And as you said, Cheryl, to go back and then complain, right? So if we don't participate in any said system, then we are still by function a byproduct of this, of what happens, the result. And so it's more of a challenge for everyone to say, like, am I a mature voter? Am I a mature civic, citizen, to say that, if my person didn't make it to the nomination, or I'm not really thrilled about either one, do I sit back and do nothing? Do I not participate in the game? Do I take my ball and go home? Do I pout? We have our grown-up versions of pouting and temper tantrums, but we are essentially doing the same thing, right? And so one of the things we spoke about in our last session, this is part 2, it was so good, we had to double back and do it twice because it was unpacking all of the things, so many things, that we can't be a one issue voter as well, right?
That's
no
right.
One person checks 100% of the boxes, right? I probably shouldn't say this, I'm a newlywed, but if you have a spouse, no, we're human. No one person is 100% of anything. But what I think we've lost, Mrs. Neal, with the connection, she was in remote access. But we have to be mature enough, right, Mr. Jason, to say, okay, what can I get? What is the best? What are all of the things that are important to me, and who meets them the most? Who's going to get closer to it? And yes, sometimes you do have to reverse engineer that and say, who's farthest away from what I really have disdain for. But you have to be called to some type of action to do it and to move things forward, again, as a birthright. So I think so much of that comes from people not truly understanding that, how their everyday life is affected. And so I thought that video, albeit years and years old now, needs to replay and go viral and be across the school systems, be everywhere, so people can truly understand that day-to-day activity that or ills that they're challenged with comes from the people that are in office, comes from those elections, comes from the elections that are in between the major 4-year presidential elections. And so the more we educate people, the more we get them to seeing that this is a thing to do because it's just your way to do it, is the better that we all are. So I thought I was on the screen. So I just want to challenge everyone today, as you kind of leave, to really start to have these conversations. I would say at the water cooler, but as a former HR person, you can't talk too much politics at the office, but you get what I mean, right? In the proverbial sense, we want to be having these conversations with each other, challenging each other, to make sure that we're moving forward and we're voting and we're having the conversations and we're picking each other's brains and we're seeing something in candidates that maybe we didn't necessarily understand. But we're also seeing that if we don't choose one, somebody got to win the game. Someone is leaving home with the trophy, right? So make sure that you're advocating in the right direction for what matters to you and your views the most. So are there any parting words you can give for us. We have most newly registered voters do not know how to go vote. There aren't any formal guidelines or instructions. So we have that from one of our Instagram comments. And this is so true. This is another reason why our organization and many and the like are trying to, again, educate people. There is no shortage of places and organizations out here right now that are showing you how to do that. BTheNow is one of them. You can go to BTheNow.org to get more information. Anybody, I don't know if there's any more comments that we can add, but as we close out, Mr. Jackson, any parting words that you can give people to push and prod them to be more engaged and see this as the birthright that it is?
Yeah, Coach K, I think you outlined it very, very well. The 2 points I would say in closing, I never use the filter, the lesser of two evils.
Right.
Because if you use that filter, you're already starting off in the most negative way, right? Mm-hmm. I think you got to change the lens to say which of these two candidates will at least 75%, 80% agree with my interests, right? Because to your point, nothing is 100%. And I challenge everyone this way. If you were a CEO of a company and you are looking to hire an individual to help you run your company, you got executive A and executive B, and you're looking at their resumes. One resume says the person is 77, 91 felonies, 2 indictments, 4 indictments, 2 impeachments. That's one resume. Got another resume. The individual's about to turn 82, right? A little older than the first one, but still, right? And this individual got 50 years of experience in governing. The other one had 4 years, but I wouldn't call that experience. Which candidate would you hire to help you run your company? And if you don't like that filter, I would say this, because you're right. A lot of folks saying, well, because what's happening over in Gaza, it is horrific. That's a terrible situation, 10,000 miles away. But I'm going to end the way I started. You got to focus on home. You got to focus on home, because the things that are 10,000 miles away will take care of itself. But if you're not focusing on where you live, your neighborhood, your city, your state, and looking at everyone that's on the ballot from the top to the bottom, don't leave not one position blank. You need to vote who's going to be your sheriff, who's going to be your DA, who's going to be your coroner, who's going to be your representative, who's going to be your judges. Everyone. You have an opportunity to let your voice be heard. And if you do not exercise your civic duty, the only person you can blame at home is the person that you see in the mirror every morning.
You know what, Derek, I'm glad you mentioned, the sheriff, and, because we need people to understand that it's not all about just the national election, the federal election. It's about the local election as well. That's probably those are the most important elections that are going to affect you on a daily basis. So your local, your state, as well as for the president of the United States. But I'm going to just piggyback off what you said in terms of people, how do you explain to people, not how they should vote, but what to look for when they're looking for a candidate. And sometimes, because we've been hearing a lot about both candidates are old. One is old, one, has all these counts or whatever. Some people don't care about the counts. Let's just be frank. They don't care about what's going on that side. They're still like, okay, regardless, I'm gonna vote for whoever I want to. So what I do is try to tell individuals, don't always look at the two candidates, but look at the party itself. Look at the party itself. Look at the party that aligns best with your beliefs, or what's going to more, help your family, your community more. So I tell women, if you have an issue with Roe versus Wade being overturned, well, look at, look at which group is for it and which is against it. If you are a minority and you're not happy with what just happened with affirmative action, or what's happening with this DEI, what's happening in these colleges now that they are eliminating these scholarships for underprivileged minorities and all that, then you have to look at which party is for it and which party is against it. It's as simple as that. That's what I try to break it down is so easy that a third grader could understand it. So it's not a one, it's not a I'm not gonna say what Kay had mentioned. It's not just one thing that you're focusing on. You're focusing on several things, because there may be one thing that you disagree with, but 5 things that you do. So you have to go with the party that aligns on a more positive note for you, your family, and your community. That's how I view it.
Absolutely. And that's the only way we really should view it, right? Because in all honesty, I mean, when you think about it, it's just not the federal government. It's not just the state government. It's your county, it's your city, it's your alderman, it's everyone that impacts your being, right? We all desire to have a quality of life. And so in order for you to help shape that quality of life, you got to look at the individuals in the party that's going to help you have the quality of life that you desire. If you think that quality of life, because we're comfortable, will never be, we'll always have a democracy. Like I said, just stay tuned. And the other sad part, Cheryl, a lot of our young people, what's their news source? They're not watching the news. And so they're almost like disengaged to begin with. They're not, what's their news source? Their news source can't be Charlemagne the God. Their news source can't be Candace, right? And so they're just giving opinions because they're not even in this space. They're not even doing the work, right? They just got a huge followership. But when you hear someone say, yeah, you shouldn't vote, that is the most ridiculous comment I ever heard. You shouldn't vote. Hold your vote. I mean, like, dude, shut up. Because first off, that is not sound advice to say that, right? And so I just think that it's malpractice for these individuals with these huge followings to give their opinion that is useless. They're not the subject matter expert. And so that's a concern that I have. What's the news source for our young people? It's not Black Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, and that's okay. I just think that we have to continue to use our voices. We have to continue to be loud. There's so many organizations across the country that are getting the message out there. We all have to collaborate, and we have to be louder and talk to as many people as we can, just like those individuals are doing, and sort of to exit out. But it is, with the time being 9:05, Kay was going to close it out. I hate to do it because, Derek, this is some amazing information that you provided. I mean, and I hope people have time to go back and really study what Derek has said, how he went back, just like our previous caller, Vernon Johnson, did in the first, in part 1. He actually went back and gave the history of why the Voting Rights Act was in play and then talked about the present and then what could potentially happen in the future if we don't continue to get the right people in office with our interests at heart. So I thank you so much, Derek, for that commentary. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. And Kay, will you close us out?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you all enjoyed the conversation, and we're looking to stay engaged here at BTheNow. BTheNow.org is where you can reach us on our website. Make sure you check your status, get registered, pass this information on, but more importantly, follow us on all of our social media handles. BTheNow. We're on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, so that you won't miss our next live stream here on StreamYard. We definitely have to be advocates for what we want to see in the future and make sure that we understand that voting is our birthright and moving it forward. So we're excited that you joined us. We hope it won't be the last time, and have a great, great night.
Thank you.
Enough electoral votes, more than 270, more